A young woman dies suddenly, and a grieving husband violently guards her body from the rest of the world. Meanwhile, a mother, shattered by grief, claims a spirit visited her bedside to whisper a horrific, hidden truth. What makes this story extraordinary is the impossible outcome. In a nation built on cold logic, the justice system sent a man to prison for life based on the testimony of a ghost. The true mystery is not who committed the murder, but how a phantom's word forced a willfully blind system to finally open its eyes. To understand how an entire community could look away from a murder, you first have to understand the ground it happened on. Greenbrier County, West Virginia, in the winter of 1897, was not a place that welcomed the outside world. Nestled deep within the rigid, undulating spine of the Appalachian Mountains, it was a landscape of steep hollows and dense, unforgiving timber. When the bitter winter snows moved in, packing the dirt roads and freezing the creeks, the hollows became entirely cut off from the rest of the country. The cold did not just chill the air, it locked the people in together. In these high, lonely elevations, survival was not guaranteed by the government or the distant, glittering cities on the coast. It was guaranteed only by the wood you chopped and the neighbors you kept. A journey of mere miles could take a full day in the worst of the weather, leaving the small farming communities to function as their own isolated, sovereign worlds. Because the geography forced them into this stark isolation, the people of Greenbrier County relied heavily on a tight-knit web of kinship and shared hardship. They were resourceful, fiercely independent, and bound by a quiet code of minding their own affairs. Out here, the rigid lines that separated modern science, rudimentary law, and ancient mountain folklore were often profoundly blurred. A sudden illness might be treated with a harsh chemical poultice recommended by an old country doctor, or it might just as easily be attributed to a bad omen, a draught of night air, or the judgment of God. It was a culture suspended precariously between the encroaching industrial age and the superstitions of the old world, where people still held a quiet, unshakable belief that the dead did not always rest easy if their business among the living was left unfinished. When the modern world did arrive, it came slowly, carried on the backs of traveling preachers and transient workers looking for a fresh start where no one knew their name. In this trusting environment, a stranger could invent himself anew, and the community would not ask too many questions about the darkness he might have left behind. This isolation bled deeply into the fragile institutions that were supposed to protect the vulnerable. The rural medical and legal systems of the 19th century American backcountry were entirely inadequate for untangling the darker complexities of human malice. Country doctors were often exhausted men of limited, outdated training who carried their entire medical practice in a single leather bag, diagnosing fatal ailments by guesswork and visual observation alone. The coroners and local magistrates were typically elected men of the community, farmers or local merchants, with absolutely no formal forensic education. When a sudden death occurred, the machinery of the law was not designed to seek out hidden foul play. It was designed to process the body quickly, issue a socially acceptable certificate of death, and move on with the brutal demands of daily life. These men of authority were profoundly eager to close a case rather than open a wound. A thorough criminal investigation meant asking ugly, uncomfortable questions of familiar faces, risking the delicate social harmony that held the isolated mountain towns together. If a young woman passed away suddenly in her home, the initial instinct of the authorities was not suspicion, but a kind of weary resignation. Life in the mountains was already fragile, and sudden death was a familiar, if unwelcome, guest. The men who set down the official records were far more likely to attribute a violent passing to a sudden faint, a weak heart, or the vague medical terminology of the era, rather than accuse a seemingly grieving husband of an unthinkable crime. The burden of proof in these valleys was unimaginably high, and the tools to find it were practically non-existent. They did not look for murder because they simply did not wish to find it, knowing the terrible communal cost of tearing a family apart in the public square. In the bitter shadow of the Appalachians, it was a town that preferred quiet tragedies over loud truths. Into this quiet, tightly bound world stepped Elva Zona Hista. Born into the solemn rhythms of the Appalachian hills, Zona possessed a restless, vibrant spirit that seemed inherently at odds with the predictable, arduous life laid out before her. In her early 20s, she was striking, full of life, and quietly desperate for a future that extended beyond the familiar, grueling chores of rural domesticity. In the late 19th century, a young woman's prospects in a remote hollow were rigidly defined by the men available in her immediate vicinity. Marriage was not merely a romantic pursuit, it was the sole acceptable avenue for social and economic survival. Zona was looking for a spark, a promise of something broader than the harsh mountains that encircled her home. In the autumn of 1896, that spark arrived in the form of a transient blacksmith. His name was Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe, though he introduced himself to the locals simply as Edward. In a county where surnames were rooted in the local soil for generations, a newcomer was an immediate curiosity. Shoe was a striking anomaly. He was broadly built, carrying the dense, heavy muscle of a man who worked iron for a living. More than his physical strength, he possessed a smooth, intensely charismatic demeanor that effortlessly turned the heads of the local women and disarmed the cautious skepticism of the men. He was quick to buy a round of drinks, quick to offer a flattering compliment, and masterful at weaving a narrative of a hard-working tradesman looking to settle down and build a respectable life. Yet, beneath the heavy leather apron and the practiced, easy smile, there was a quiet, ambiguous darkness to him. Edward Shoe was a man without a visible history, carrying an unspoken past that he carefully and deliberately shielded from the prying eyes of his new neighbors. There were fleeting, unsettling moments that betrayed the charming facade. A sudden, terrifying hardening of his jaw, a flash of cold, calculating fury in his light eyes when he was contradicted, or the way his thick hands would grip a tool just a fraction too tightly. It was an underlying, simmering aggression that he was always quick to bury under a loud laugh, but it was there, a coiled spring waiting in the dark. Zona was entirely captivated. To a young woman seeking an escape from the ordinary, the rugged, confident blacksmith represented a thrilling departure from the predictable local farm boys. Their courtship was remarkably, almost alarmingly, brief. Shoe pursued her with a suffocating, possessive intensity, eager to secure her before the initial blinding infatuation could cool into rational inquiry. He shadowed her steps, overwhelmed her with attention, and rapidly isolated her from her peers. Within a matter of mere weeks of their first meeting, they were married. The town, generally eager to welcome a strong, able-bodied worker into their local economy, offered their polite blessings, willing to overlook the extreme swiftness of the union in favor of the prosperity he seemed to promise. But there was one person in Greenbrier County who remained entirely immune to Edward Shoe's magnetic charm. Mary Jane Hista, Zona's mother, watched the whirlwind courtship with a mounting, visceral dread. History and local law have sometimes attempted to paint Mary Jane as a superstitious hill woman, a frantic mother prone to spectral visions and religious hysteria. The historical record, however, suggests a woman far more grounded, formidable, and dangerously perceptive. She was a deeply observant pragmatist who had spent a lifetime reading the harsh, unvarnished truths of the people around her. She did not need a supernatural premonition to see what Edward Shue was. She only needed to watch the way he looked at her daughter. Mary Jane saw the dark possessiveness that masqueraded as romantic affection. She noticed the subtle, isolating tactics he employed, intentionally cutting Zona off from her familiar comforts and dominating the physical space in every room they entered. She recognized the quiet, heavy red flags of a violently controlling man, the unpredictable mood swings, the veiled demands for absolute obedience, signs that the rest of the town gladly ignored in the name of minding their own business. Mary Jane pleaded with Zona, arguing fiercely against the marriage, warning her daughter that the charming stranger was nothing more than a hollow facade, hiding something fundamentally broken and dangerous. But young love is famously deaf to the desperate warnings of the old. Zona, swept up in the forceful, overwhelming tide of Shue's attention, defied her mother's fierce objections. She took his name, packed her meager belongings, and moved into the small timber house he had secured, stepping over the threshold into a life that was now completely hidden from public view. Mary Jane knew her daughter was walking into a trap, but in 1897, a wife belonged to a husband, and a mother could only watch. On the bitterly cold morning of January 23, 1897, the quiet, isolated routine of the Shue household came to a devastating and abrupt end. A young neighbor boy, sent on a simple errand to ask if the blacksmith's wife needed anything from the local market, walked up to the timber house. Receiving no answer to his repeated knocking, he pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the dim interior. He found Elva Zona Hiester lying entirely motionless at the foot of the narrow wooden stairs. She was stretched out unnaturally, her body rigid and cold against the floorboards, her vibrant life extinguished in an empty house. The boy, gripped by immediate terror, turned and ran frantically through the biting winter air to summon help, setting in motion a tragic farce of justice that would define the county for a century. By the time the news reached the local authorities and the county physician was summoned, the crime scene had already been irrevocably compromised. Edward Shue did not wait for the law or the medical establishment to arrive. Rushing home from his blacksmith shop, he took absolute, aggressive control of his wife's remains. Instead of leaving the body undisturbed for the coroner to examine, as was customary even in rural jurisdictions, Shue scooped Elva up in his massive arms and carried her to the upstairs bedroom. He began to put on a terrifying, theatrical display of overwhelming grief. He wept hysterically, wailing and clutching the body to his chest, creating a chaotic atmosphere of mourning that successfully intimidated anyone who dared to step through the front door. In the late 19th century, the preparation of a deceased woman for burial was a strictly enforced social ritual. It was the solemn duty of the older women in the community to wash the body, dress the hair, and clothe the deceased for the casket. Edward Shue violently shattered this tradition. He vehemently refused to let the neighbor women cross the threshold of the bedroom, claiming that his sorrow was too profound to allow strangers to touch his beloved bride. He locked himself in the room and washed and dressed the corpse entirely by himself. When he finally opened the door, the women found Elva dressed in a dark, incredibly stiff, high-neck dress. More bizarrely, Shue had wrapped a thick, heavily folded scarf tightly around her throat. When a neighbor gently questioned the heavy winter garment on a woman resting in her parlor, Shue snapped back that the scarf had been Elva's absolute favorite accessory, and he insisted she would have wanted to carry it with her into the earth. The profound failure of the local medical system arrived shortly after, in the form of Dr. George W. Knapp. As the aging physician entered the bedroom to determine the cause of death, he was met not by a grieving widower seeking answers, but by a hostile guard dog protecting a secret. Knapp began a rudimentary examination, checking the heart and the torso, noting nothing immediately out of the ordinary. However, the moment the doctor's hands moved upward toward Elva's head and the thick scarf concealing her neck, Shu erupted. He paced the room with explosive, unpredictable energy, shouting and weeping so aggressively that the older, weary physician felt physically threatened. Rather than challenging the volatile blacksmith or demanding a proper forensic examination of the neck, Dr. Knapp simply backed away. He gathered his medical bag, retreated from the house, and officially diagnosed the cause of death as an everlasting faint. It was a completely meaningless medical term, a desperate scribbling by a doctor who simply wanted to escape a hostile room. Perhaps realizing how legally absurd the diagnosis sounded, Knapp would later quietly alter the official death certificate to read childbirth complications, despite there being absolutely no physical evidence that Elva had been pregnant or in labor. The paperwork was filed in the county courthouse. The legal requirement was fulfilled. The machinery of rural justice processed the tragedy with blinding speed, entirely bypassing the glaring, aggressive anomalies of the husband's behavior. The funeral was arranged with the same desperate haste. As Elva was laid out for the community to mourn, Shu remained stationed at the very head of the casket. He had placed a large pillow on one side of her face and a rolled-up piece of cloth on the other, claiming it was to help her rest more comfortably. He paced relentlessly, his eyes darting across the room, stepping forward to physically block anyone who leaned in too close to the coffin. The town, deeply uncomfortable with the intense display, but bound by their code of minding their own business, bowed their heads and threw the dirt upon the grave. The bitter Appalachian winter swallowed the tragedy whole. The law was satisfied, the doctor was satisfied, and the husband was safe. But in their desperate haste to close the book on Elva Zona Heaster, the men of Greenbrier County had forgotten entirely about the mother. Mary Jane Heaster was left to navigate a silence that felt heavier than the Appalachian winter itself. Her daughter was buried in the frozen earth, and the man she had always known was a monster, was walking freely through the town, playing the role of the tragic widower. She did not weep with the loud, performative hysteria that Edward Shu had displayed over the casket. Her grief was a quiet, suffocating weight, hardened by the absolute, visceral certainty that Elva had been brutally stolen from her. She could not sleep, and she refused to rest. Driven by a desperate, consuming need to uncover what the town doctor had so easily ignored, she performed a solemn, desperate ritual of her own. She acquired a white sheet from the very room where her daughter had died, brought the fabric back to her own isolated home, and began to pray. She prayed fiercely, day and night, demanding not comfort, but the unvarnished truth. What followed in the dark of her bedroom has been passed down for generations as a mountain ghost story, a piece of eerie local folklore designed to frighten children. But when viewed through the lens of a mother's trauma and the historical record, it reads less like a haunting and more like the profound, unbreakable intuition of a woman pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance. Mary Jane claimed that for 4 consecutive nights, the air in her room grew unnaturally cold, and Elva's spirit materialized at her bedside. At first, the apparition was formless and erratic, weeping in the shadows as if searching for a life forever lost. But as the nights wore on, the figure grew vividly clear, stepping out of the darkness. The sorrowful wailing slowly gave way to a chilling, deliberate voice. This was no vague, ethereal phantom speaking in abstract riddles. The spirit that stood before Mary Jane delivered a testimony of agonizing, meticulous precision. The apparition recounted the escalating terror of her short marriage, detailing the quiet abuse that Edward Shue had so carefully hidden behind his charming public smile. The ghost revealed the trivial, senseless spark that had finally ignited his fatal rage. On that bitterly cold January evening, Shue had returned to the timber house, expecting a meal prepared with meat. Finding none on the table, his simmering aggression boiled over into explosive violence. He had attacked her without mercy, and the spirit was painstakingly exact about how the murder was ultimately carried out. The words Mary Jane claimed to hear did not resemble the emotional, dramatic language of a mourning parent. They mirrored the cold, objective terminology of a trained medical examiner. The apparition told her mother that Shue had grabbed her by the throat, violently crushing her windpipe beneath the overwhelming force of his heavy, iron-working hands. He had then twisted her head with such sudden brutality that the bones snapped. The spirit did not merely say her neck was broken. She specified the exact anatomical location of the catastrophic injury. The fatal break, the ghost insisted, had occurred precisely at the first and second vertebrae. It was an impossibly clinical diagnosis delivered in the dead of night. A grieving country woman who possessed absolutely no formal medical training and lived miles away from any library or hospital had just accurately described a fatal cervical fracture and a crushed trachea. She had pulled the exact, horrifying truth out of the shadows. She only needed a man of the law to listen to her. Armed with a terrifying certainty, Mary Jane Heaster descended from the isolation of her mountain home and carried her grim revelation directly to the authorities. She sought out John A. Preston, the prosecuting attorney for Greenbrier County. Preston was a man anchored entirely in the rigid world of statutes, physical evidence, and rational motive. And under any normal circumstances, a tale of a midnight apparition would have been dismissed as the tragic, unraveling delusions of a grieving mind. Yet, as Mary Jane sat before him in his office, she did not weep, nor did she speak with the frantic hysteria of the unhinged. She spoke with a cold, unwavering precision. She relayed the exact anatomical details of a crushed windpipe and snapped vertebrae, an impossible clinical vocabulary falling from the lips of a rural matriarch. Her absolute conviction struck a nerve that Preston could not simply brush aside, forcing the gears of justice to finally begin turning. The prosecutor began to ask quiet questions around the community, and the fragile silence that had hastily buried Elva Zona Heaster began to unravel. Neighbors, freed from the immediate shock of the funeral and emboldened by the authorities' sudden interest, began to voice the dark, lingering doubts they had previously kept tightly to themselves. They spoke of Edward Shue's violently possessive behavior over the casket, his explosive anger when anyone approached the head of the corpse, and the bizarre, stiff scarf wound tightly around the dead woman's throat in the suffocating warmth of a heated parlor. They remembered the oversized pillow he had used to prop up her head, a detail that now seemed less like an act of final devotion and more like a desperate attempt to keep a broken neck stabilized in public view. The circumstantial anomalies mounted rapidly until they formed an undeniable mountain of suspicion. Armed with the community's belated unease and the mother's haunting testimony, Preston took an unprecedented legal step. He officially ordered Elva's body to be exhumed from the frozen earth. The exhumation took place under the heavy, grey skies of late winter, drawing a grim, silent audience of townsfolk who gathered at the edge of the local cemetery to witness the macabre spectacle. By law, Edward Shue was compelled to be present as the dirt was systematically shoveled away from his wife's resting place. The charismatic, confident blacksmith who had so easily charmed the Hollows, was completely gone, replaced by a restless, deeply agitated man. He paced erratically around the perimeter of the open grave, his broad shoulders hunched against the biting cold, muttering loudly and darkly to anyone who would listen that the state would not be able to prove a single thing. His nervous, defensive bluster stood in stark contrast to the grim, methodical focus of the men hauling the wooden coffin back into the mountain air. The remains were transported to the only building in the immediate vicinity large enough and empty enough to serve as a makeshift morgue, the one-room local schoolhouse. Inside, where the wooden desks of children were pushed aside to make way for the grim realities of adult violence, an exhaustive forensic examination commenced. This time, there was no intimidating husband guarding the door, and the investigation was not left to the hasty assumptions of a single, frightened physician. A panel of 3 doctors, including a thoroughly chastened Dr. George W. Knapp, prepared to conduct a genuine autopsy. They systematically examined the heart, the lungs, and the abdomen, finding the organs of a perfectly healthy young woman. Then, they finally turned their attention to the neck, stripping away the heavy clothing and the terrible secrets it had concealed for weeks. What they found beneath the discolored flesh was a breathtaking confirmation of the impossible. The doctors discovered that the windpipe had been brutally crushed, bearing the unmistakable physical trauma of a violent, sustained strangulation. Upon closer inspection of the spine, the final horrifying layer of the truth was laid bare. The neck had been forcefully broken, the ligaments torn, and the bones completely severed. When the physicians documented the exact location of the fatal fracture, they recorded a detail that defied all rational explanation. The break had occurred precisely at the first and second cervical vertebrae. It was an exact, flawless anatomical match to the whispered testimony delivered in the dark of a mountain cabin. The doctors looked at the broken bones, realizing that the ghost in Mary Jane's bedroom was far more observant than the medical establishment of Greenbrier County. By the time the warm, heavy air of June 1897 settled over the Appalachian Hollows, the Greenbrier County Courthouse had become the undeniable center of gravity for the entire region. The trial of Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe was no longer merely a local tragedy. It had mutated into a sprawling, unprecedented public spectacle. The wooden benches of the gallery were packed to the very rafters with spectators who had traveled miles by foot and wagon, leaving their farms and businesses behind, driven by an insatiable hunger to witness the collision of a brutal murder and a mountain legend. The air inside the room was stifling, thick with the heat of hundreds of bodies and the collective, electric anticipation of the crowd. They expected a circus. They expected to hear a tale of the supernatural paraded before the solemn bench of the law. They wanted to see the muscular blacksmith who had crushed his young wife's neck, and they desperately wanted to hear from the mother who claimed the dead had spoken. Prosecuting attorney John A. Preston, however, had absolutely no intention of feeding the gallery's appetite for Appalachian folklore. Preston was a pragmatic man, anchored firmly to the tangible world, a legal architect who understood that in a 19th century court of law, introducing spirits into evidence was a guaranteed path to a swift acquittal. He built his case against the blacksmith with cold, deliberate calculation. He stripped away every whisper of the supernatural, grounding his argument entirely in the undeniable brutality of the physical autopsy. Preston summoned the 3 physicians to the stand, forcing them to publicly recount the devastating medical truth they had uncovered in the local schoolhouse. The crushed windpipe, the torn ligaments, and the severed cervical vertebrae, following the doctors, the prosecutor called a relentless procession of neighbors to testify to Shu's bizarre, circumstantial behavior. They spoke of his violent possessiveness over the casket, his explosive anger when anyone approached the head of the corpse, and the inexplicable, stiff winter scarf wrapped tightly around the throat of a woman resting in a heated parlor. As Shu sat at the defense table, his earlier arrogant bluster hardening into a tight, nervous anger, Preston painted a devastating, airtight portrait of a guilty man attempting to conceal a horrific act of domestic violence. Throughout his entire, meticulous presentation, the prosecutor expertly and intentionally avoided any mention of nocturnal visitations or midnight voices. He knew that the mother's intuition had led them to the buried body, but he also knew that only hard, forensic science could send the killer to a concrete cell. This methodical, ironclad approach backed Shu's defense team into a desperate, suffocating corner. The physical evidence was overwhelmingly damning, aligning perfectly with the timeline of the blacksmith's violent outburst. The defense attorney realized with sinking dread that he could not defeat the medical facts, nor could he easily explain away his client's highly theatrical, hostile behavior at the funeral. He needed a distraction, something so thoroughly absurd that it would derail the prosecution's entire, carefully constructed narrative. He made a calculated, incredibly high-risk gamble. If he could not break the autopsy report, he would have to break the woman who had demanded it. To save Edward Shu from a life behind bars, the defense lawyer decided to take the very ghost story the prosecution had so carefully buried and drag it directly into the blinding light of the courtroom. When it was time for Mary Jane Heaster to take the witness stand, the defense laid a deliberate trap. In the late 1800s, the legal system was already inherently skeptical of female witnesses, frequently dismissing their deeply felt emotions and intuitions as mere hysteria. The defense attorney planned to exploit this prejudice to its absolute limit. He would be the one to introduce the ghost to the jury. It was a brutal, cynical legal strategy born of pure desperation. The defense thought that if they forced Mary Jane to talk about ghosts on the stand, pushing her to detail her spectral visions before a panel of rational, pragmatic men, the jury would immediately dismiss her as an insane, hysterical old woman, taking the credibility of the entire case down with her. When Mary Jane Heaster was finally called to the stand, the defense attorney immediately launched his calculated, theatrical assault. He did not ask her about her daughter's brief marriage or Edward Shu's violent temper. Instead, he drove the questioning straight into the dark of her isolated mountain cabin. With a mocking, condescending tone designed specifically to humiliate, he aggressively interrogated her about the 4 nights of spectral visitations. He demanded to know the precise shape of the ghost, the exact quality of the lighting in the room, and whether the spirit had spoken in a faint whisper or a terrifying wail. The lawyer paced the floor, firing questions in rapid, dizzying succession, desperately trying to trap the older woman in a logical contradiction. His entire objective was to rattle her, hoping to push her into a state of frantic, hysterical rambling that would easily allow the all-male jury to dismiss her as a deeply unstable, grieving mother prone to wild delusions. But Mary Jane never wavered. Under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the packed courtroom, the grieving matriarch remained utterly unbreakable. She did not raise her voice in anger, nor did she shrink away from the defense's relentless mockery. Instead, she sat with a profound, terrifying dignity, answering every single condescending question with calm, unshakable conviction. When the attorney sneered and asked if she was simply dreaming or suffering from a severe winter fever, she looked directly at him and steadily maintained that her daughter had stood in the room, bringing the terrible truth of her murder. Her sorrow was palpable, filling the suffocating heat of the courthouse, but it was anchored by an ironclad certainty that completely disarmed the hostility of her interrogator. She refused to be embarrassed, and she absolutely refused to alter a single detail of the horrific anatomical revelation she had been given in the night. The defense's cynical gamble backfired with devastating finality. Instead of exposing a fragile, delusional mind, the aggressive cross-examination only highlighted Mary Jane's absolute sincerity. As the jury watched her withstand the brutal questioning without a single tear of surrender or a moment of hesitation, the atmosphere in the room fundamentally shifted. The men in the box did not see a mountain witch or a hysterical madwoman. They saw a mother's pure, fierce love manifesting in the only way a powerless woman could make a dismissive world listen. More importantly, they realized that regardless of whether they personally believed in roaming spirits, they could not ignore the undeniable, concrete medical facts lying on the coroner's table. The ghostly testimony of a crushed windpipe and a snapped spine matched the physical autopsy with a flawless, terrifying precision that no grieving hallucination could ever produce. The grueling trial concluded, and the fate of Edward Shue was finally handed over to the jury. Despite the spectacular, highly unusual nature of the defense's strategy, the men tasked with delivering justice did not need to debate the existence of the afterlife. They retreated to their chambers, weighing the bizarre circumstantial evidence of the funeral against the irrefutable forensic reality of the broken cervical vertebrae. The deliberation was remarkably brief for a case that had captured the entire state's attention. After merely 1 hour and 10 minutes of quiet discussion, the jury returned to the breathless courtroom. They looked at the charismatic blacksmith, now entirely stripped of his charming facade, and delivered a definitive verdict of guilty. Edward Shue had silenced his young wife in the isolation of the mountains, supremely confident that the lazy machinery of rural justice would bury his crime in the frozen earth. In the end, his own defense team had tried to save him by turning his mother-in-law into a public spectacle of the occult. The defense had carefully built a trap, using the supernatural, but Mary Jane walked straight through it, using the truth. Following the remarkably swift verdict, Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue was immediately remanded to the custody of the state, his arrogant facade completely shattered by a rural jury that refused to be blinded by his theatrics. He was sentenced to serve out the remainder of his natural life behind the towering, Gothic stone walls of the West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville. He did not survive long in the bleak, unforgiving environment of the 19th century prison system. Stripped of his freedom, his blacksmithing tools, and his ability to manipulate the isolated, trusting communities of the Appalachian Hollows, Shue withered away in a concrete cell. He died of an unknown epidemic illness in the spring of 1900, surviving barely 3 years after he had hastily buried his young wife in the freezing dirt of Greenbrier County. In the many decades that followed his death, the tragic demise of Elva Zona Heaster slowly mutated from a documented legal proceeding into a staple of Appalachian folklore. It was passed down through generations as a chilling campfire tale, eventually immortalized on a state historical marker as the only known case in American history where the testimony of a ghost helped convict a murderer. People are naturally drawn to a ghost story because it offers a comforting, cosmic illusion. The idea that the universe possesses a supernatural failsafe, ensuring that the dead will ultimately return from the void to balance the scales of justice when the living fail to do so. But if you look past the local legend and examine the cold, fragile pages of the county court record, a much deeper and far more profound narrative emerges from the shadows. The American justice system, an institution built entirely on rigid logic and physical proof, did not actually send a man to prison on the ethereal word of a phantom. The 12 men sitting in the jury box did not convict Edward Shue because a spirit wept in the dark corner of a bedroom. They convicted him on the undeniable, empirical evidence of a brutally crushed windpipe and perfectly severed cervical vertebrae. The ghost did not testify on the wooden witness stand. It was the broken body of a vibrant young woman, finally allowed to speak for itself under the bright, clinical light of a medical examination, that ultimately condemned the blacksmith to his fate. The true miracle of Greenbrier County was never that a restless spirit walked the earth in the dead of winter. The real miracle was the absolute, unyielding stubbornness of a grieving mother in a society that fully expected a woman of her station to mourn in absolute silence. Mary Jane Heaster was a powerless figure living in a deeply patriarchal, isolated world that was perfectly willing to let a murderer walk free simply to avoid an uncomfortable community scandal. Yet, her fierce love and piercing intuition refused to let the dark earth settle over her daughter's tragedy. She weaponized her devastating grief, using the only supernatural language her superstitious community would pause to listen to, and forced a lazy, fundamentally broken legal system to finally do its job and dig up the terrifying truth that was buried right beneath its feet.